I'm a bit of an oddity in ministry. I'm in my early 30s, single, minority, undereducated woman who did not grow up in a Christian home or as a PK. And over the years, it's presented some interesting dynamics for me. And I'm incredibly grateful for the story that God is writing in my life. And honestly, I'm not the most qualified. I'm certainly not the most brilliant or talented or even godly person around. So I'm just as surprised as the next person for really the story that God is writing in my life and some of the amazing things in building the church and in ministry and in preaching the gospel that I've been able to do since I started in full-time ministry when I was 19 years old. And yet, there was a time in my life where I wasn't quite so grateful for being odd. I wasn't really embracing my uniqueness. Instead, I was really full of a lot of insecurity, especially when it came to, the unique story that God was writing in my life. I remember walking into some environments in my early 20s as a youth pastor, being in youth workers training sessions or conferences, and I was the only single woman in the room. And then in my mid-20s, when I was associate pastoring, I remember being in some networks and some different training sessions for pastors and being the only female, being mistaken for being the PA or somebody's daughter. And I remember when I started executive pastoring in my late 20s, I would sit in rooms with peers, except for they didn't feel like peers because they were at least a decade older than me and had twice as much experience. And really it left me with a lot of insecurity. I found myself trying to be somebody I was not, trying to impress people, trying to prove something. I was constantly worried about what people thought of me, and I would look at different preachers and different leaders in church and in business, and I would try to model myself after them, and I'd try to preach like that preacher, or I'd try to lead like that person who wrote this great book, and I would even adapt my style and my interest to be like the people that I thought were successful. And in the midst of that, I was losing sight of the unique story that God was writing in my life. I remember it came to a head in my mid-20s. I was 25, and I remember I was asked to speak at God Chicks Conference, which is a women's conference at Oasis Church, and at that point had a couple thousand women attending, and it was the biggest audience that I had ever preached a message in front of at that point. And I was terrified, to say the least. As it got closer to the day of conference, I became more and more overwhelmed with my own insecurities. I was so worried about how I would do and how people would respond, and I wanted to impress people, and I was getting so off focus. And I remember the night before I was supposed to preach the message at God Chicks, I was praying, and the Holy Spirit spoke to me so clearly and challenged me and said, I don't want you actually to take up any notes when you preach tomorrow. Instead, I want you to be obedient to what I want you to say, because I want you to be rid of this insecurity that's been weighing you down, and I want you to experience what it looks like and what it feels like to have me be strong in your weakness. I had worked on this message for hours and hours. So the thought of not bringing up my notes seemed so scary, and I wrestled with God. I fought it, but I knew I needed to be obedient. So when the actual time to preach the message came, I didn't take up any notes. Instead, I really spoke what I felt like the Holy Spirit was asking me to speak. And honestly, still to this day, years forward, I get asked about that message, and it was such an environment where God's presence was there, and there was amazing ministry that took place, and it was a moment of liberation for me, a moment that I began to realize that I'm not supposed to be like somebody else. I'm an original, and what God is doing in my life is one of a kind. I want to encourage you. You are an original. You are a one of a kind, and the story that God is writing is going to look unique in your life. You don't have to copycat somebody else. You don't have to compare yourself to other people's stories or other people's gifting or other people's opportunities. Instead, you could be confident in who God made you and what God has called you uniquely to do. And as you're reading today, I want you to embrace the uniqueness that God has made you. I want you to take some time and dwell on the fact that God made you specifically, and you are one of a kind. You are a unique design from the great designer. God has great things in store for you, and you'll only walk in that when you actually embrace who you are and stop trying to be somebody else. David was willing to do that. He said no to somebody else's armor, and he approached the giant Goliath with what he knew to be true to him. He took a slingshot, he took some stones, and extraordinary things happened. I pray that you'd be willing to do the same.